Hello and welcome everyone once again to the Word of the Day podcast where useful words are pleasantly explained. I'm your host Jamie Silva and I'm recording this for you as always from the cozy confines of the RAV4 studios, and it's time to leap right in and explore today's word. It's a noun this time, umbrage, and in my mind this just means offense. Now, I've only seen this word in one phrase, take umbrage, which means take offense, as in, I take offense at your insinuation that I am bad at parallel parking. The online edition of umbrage mostly agrees, reading, quote, offense or annoyance, unquote. The annoyance angle is a little new to me, but I suppose it does work as long as it's directed at a person's actions and not at abstract annoying things. Like if you were driving around for a long time looking unsuccessfully for a parking spot, that might be frustrating and annoying, but I don't think you can take umbrage exactly. However, if someone pulls into a spot that you were just about to take and your blinker was clearly on, you might feel resentful towards that person. You would have a beef with them. And by extension, I suppose you could take umbrage at their rude behavior. I would still maintain that the offense idea is a bit more common with umbrage, but I suppose we can broaden the meaning to annoyance or resentment as well. And notice, by the way, that in the examples thus far, the speaker isn't taking umbrage at people per se, they're taking umbrage at their words or actions or behavior. It's kind of a fine line, but in terms of structuring a sentence, you want to go with something like this. Peter took umbrage at Paul's lazy attitude, rather than Peter took umbrage at Paul for being lazy. The etymology here is pretty interesting, which is why we'll talk about it. Umbrage comes from the old French word umbrage, meaning shade or shadow. And in fact, there is a mostly obsolete meaning of umbrage that means exactly this. So you could reference the umbrage of an oak tree on a hot summer day. That French word, by the way, is also where we get the word umbrella from. People obviously think of umbrellas as being only for protection against the rain, but of course they can also shelter you from the sun if the thought of getting a tan terrifies you. Now, of course, we think of handheld umbrellas meant to ward off the sun as parasols. And, unsurprisingly, parasol in Spanish, for example, translates literally to for the sun. Using umbrellas or parasols for shade was all that they were good for up until the early 18th century, when a waterproof version was invented, once again in France. But surprisingly, this glorious advancement in keeping people dry was not received with gratitude everywhere. Instead, early umbrella adopters in England in the 1750s were subject to widespread mockery for their ridiculous fashion choices, and they were occasionally even attacked by horse-drawn cab drivers whose businesses were threatened by umbrellas. Because if these newfangled contraptions caught on, rainy days would no longer encourage pedestrians to seek shelter in a cab. One could say that the cab drivers took umbrage at this assault on their livelihoods, in the sense that they were resentful of umbrella carriers and wished them ill. And one would think that those with umbrellas had a great excuse for taking umbrage as well at all the abuse they received. Incidentally, if you want to hear more about umbrellas' cold reception in 18th century England, might I recommend episode 5 of the Pessimists Archive, which is a new podcast that tells the stories of how many of the technologies and advancements we take for granted today were widely viewed as threats to humanity when they were first introduced. And I also like the Pessimists Archive because it features some very well-written outrage by various old-timey technology skeptics who knew their way around the English language and used plenty of quaint and rare vocabulary to boot. Anyway, back to umbrage, which, as you recall, involves taking offense, being annoyed, etc. It's time to hit the usage, which is extra simple. Once again, you just see it in that one phrase that I mentioned at the beginning, take umbrage. And the idea here is that you really have no reason to say, what you just said offends me personally, when instead you can say, I take great umbrage at that remark. Now, you hardly ever hear this version, so I don't exactly recommend it, but theoretically you can give umbrage too, not just take it. So if you give umbrage, that means you have offended or insulted someone else. And intriguingly, there is one definition I found that kind of combines both the shade and the offense meanings. And this one describes umbrage as that feeling of being overshadowed as a result of someone metaphorically standing in your light or in your way, which then causes you to feel jealous or offended or resentful of that overshadower. And as a result, you take umbrage, having first, of course, been given umbrage or put in the shade. But again, I only present this angle because it's fun. I don't think you need to worry about remembering or using it. As long as you are able to respond to slights and offenses with, "I must take umbrage at your baseless allegations," or something of that sort, then my work here is done. Let's now run through a couple examples of how umbrage might appear in standard conversation or writing. Example number 1. Old Mr. Wells took serious umbrage at any attempts to assist him with his gardening, despite the fact that the sorry state of his sweet potatoes suggested he could use a bit of help. Example number 2. "I'm what? I'm a sore loser? I take great umbrage at that aspersion," said Reggie. "The parcheesi board flipped over when you knocked the table just now, that's all." Example number 3. Edgar took umbrage at any suggestion that his practice of downing 3 cups of coffee in a Red Bull before breakfast made him a bit too jittery to function properly. Example number 4 comes paraphrased from the book Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. Quote, "So jealous was he of his niece being respected that, on this very journey, he took sudden and violent umbrage at the footman's neglecting to hold her stirrup as she dismounted from her horse. And he unspeakably astonished everyone by charging at the footman on a hard-headed mule, threatening to trample him to death." Unquote. By the way, not being much of an equestrian myself, I wasn't entirely sure what the importance is of holding a stirrup as someone gets off a horse. After investigating, it seems that most likely this is just for extra stability as the rider swings down from the horse with their foot in that stirrup, though I also saw something suggesting that you actually want someone holding the stirrup on the other side of the horse, the one you're not using to dismount, so that the saddle doesn't slide off when you put all your weight on one side. But however it's supposed to go, it seems clear that footmen were supposed to handle this task back in the day, and it was exceedingly rude when this one did not, and that is why the uncle took umbrage. Okay, that is it for today's show. Thank you all very much for tuning in, and thanks to producer Pete as well for his excellent work on this episode, though it's too bad that he isn't here right now to receive the compliment, seeing as how he unfortunately took umbrage at some constructive feedback I gave him earlier about his pronunciation of Umbrage, and so he stormed out of the RAV4 studios in a huff just before we started recording. Pete, I didn't mean that how it sounded, and you're welcome back anytime. Okay, this has been the Word of the Day podcast. I'm Jamie Silva, and we'll see you next time. Now, Pete, look, I know you went to Paris last summer. I can see you wearing a beret honoring your French heritage. That's great, but with all due respect, I kind of think it's Umbrage, not Umbrage. And I'm not positive about it. Like, you could be right, maybe it isn't either of those, but, you know, I had to pick one, that one seemed like the best option. And no, I will not start calling you Pierre. Come on, just stay on as producer. Forget this ever happened.